Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name is Elena with Napa Book Mine. I am very happy tonight to welcome, sort of to Napa, Edward Slingerland, a distinguished university scholar and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia with adjunct appointments in psychology and Asian studies. He is also the director of the Database of Religious History, the author of Trying Not to Try, which was named one of the best books of 2014 by The Guardian and Brain Pickings. And of course, he's the author of the book we're going to talk about tonight, Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to mute myself, and Edward, if you want to start your presentation and
Let's
get
see if this
going.
will work. Okay. That looking good? All right. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. So I'm going to start by talking about human pleasure. So humans take pleasure in a variety of activities that may seem very different. So we enjoy, for instance, masturbation. We enjoy eating Twinkies and other sorts of junk food. We enjoy doing shots of Jägermeister, our liquor of choice. These may seem like very different types of pleasure, but what we've been told from a scientific perspective is that they're all evolutionary mistakes. So they seem very different, but at basis, they're all misfirings of evolution in various ways. So let's take masturbation first. So masturbation is a classic example of a brain hijack. So brain hijack is where we have a reward system that developed for very good adaptive reasons. So an orgasm is the best thing that can happen to a human being. Everything else is compared to orgasms. Chocolate cake is orgasmic, but not really, right? It's only a metaphor because it's really the most intense pleasure we can feel. And that's because it's most directly related to what our genes want us to do. It statistically over history has been associated with reproductive sex, and that's what our genes most directly want us to do. So an intense pleasure like an orgasm is evolution's way of saying, you did a great job. Whatever you just did, keep doing that. Humans, though, and not just humans, other animals have figured out how to game this system, have figured out that they can get that reward in other ways. So we masturbate. We engage in all sorts of non-reproductive sex. It's very much like rats when they discover that they can hit these reward circuits by hitting a lever in their cage. Just keep hitting that lever, right? So we've figured out a way to hijack our brain. We've figured out how to hijack a reward system that evolved for other reasons to give us pleasure from evolution's perspective for no good reason at all. So that's a brain hijack. And that's basically what's going on with, why can I not move on with my, let's see, there we go. So that's a brain hijack. Let's talk about Twinkies, so junk food in general. This is a classic example of what we would call an evolutionary mismatch, or what I call in the book an evolutionary hangover. So a taste for sugar and a taste for fat and liking just fatty things, sugary things, things with a lot of carbs. This was adaptive for most of our evolutionary history. So for most of our history, we had calorie problems. We needed food. If we came upon berries or some awesome source of sugar and vitamins, if we came upon meat, we should just eat as much as we could right away because these were always in short quantities in our environment. They're very important for us physiologically. And so having a taste for these things and wanting to kind of gorge on them whenever we come across them was a very adaptive thing. The problem is when we live in an environment like the one we do now, where you have things like this, and this is not Photoshop. This is actually a real picture of a thing that exists. This is some kind of hamburger, waffle, donut sundae. You can buy this now. So in this environment, an environment where you can buy things like that, it's very maladaptive to have these tastes. and it leads to obesity and diabetes and all the problems that we're familiar with. But this is a very recent problem, and it's very geographically constrained. So even to this day, there are lots of places in the world where calories are still a problem, and this taste for sugar and fat is still an adaptive thing. So this is a case where, if you think about the hijack example with masturbation, pretty low cost. Um, the hijinks we get up to are not very costly. So evolution can afford to look the other way. In this case, the mismatch, it happened really recently, and it's not even to this day very distributed broadly geographically. So again, evolution's not going to be too worried about this. So let's talk about now our taste for Jägermeister, our taste for alcohol. The standard theory that you'll hear if you open up a Psych 101 textbook, is that our taste for alcohol is like our taste for masturbation. It's an evolutionary hijack. So alcohol just happens to randomly pick a pleasure center in our brain, and we figured this out, and so we take advantage of that. So it's doing nothing adaptive. It never did. It's just kind of a mistake in the hijack sense. There are also various mismatch theories, so that our taste for alcohol might have been useful at some point because smelling alcohol and following that scent would lead us to overripe fruit, and that might be a very valuable source of calories in some of the environments we might have evolved in. Maybe alcohol was adaptive in the sense that if you had a water source that was not potable, if it was full of sewage or things that would hurt you, if you take water that is contaminated and you ferment it, it often purifies it. So beer from contaminated water is safer to drink than the water itself. So maybe it serves some kind of function. But in any case, again, like this is like a junk food example. It was adaptive at one point for some reason, but that's long gone. Nowadays, we shouldn't eat Twinkies. We shouldn't eat that sundae on top of with the hamburger and waffles on top of it, and we shouldn't drink anymore because the taste for alcohol is something that has outlived its purpose, if it ever had a purpose. Now, what I argue in the book and what I want to argue tonight is that both of these theories have to be wrong. The standard story that our taste for intoxicants, alcohol in particular, but chemical intoxicants in general, is a mistake, just can't be right. And that's because intoxication is super unlike our taste for junk food, unlike our taste for masturbation or non-reproductive sex, intoxication is very costly and dangerous. So you may have not gotten the memo on this, but masturbation does not make you go blind. But drinking vodka could make you go blind. It can harm your liver. It can give you cancer. There are all sorts of physiological costs of drinking alcohol. It's also the case that from ancient Egypt to ancient China to the present day, alcoholism has been a massive problem. So it's estimated that up to 15% of the human population is prone genetically to alcoholism, to severe alcoholism. And we all know the problems this leads to. It leads to immense physical suffering and psychological suffering on the part of the individual, but also all sorts of social costs. So costs on families, costs on societies. It's been a scourge for as long as people have had access to large amounts of alcohol. It's also costly just in terms of resources. So it's estimated that in ancient Sumer, half the grain production went to producing beer. And this was a society that wasn't living on the edge, but calories were important. And so they were taking half of their food stuff and turning it into a neurotoxin, into this thing that hurts your body. Our bodies have this very complicated mechanism for getting rid of alcohol from our systems. And yet we're taking half of our grain and turning it into this neurotoxin and voluntarily putting it in our bodies. It's estimated that today in market societies, up to a third, the estimate right now is a third of what people spend on food and drink is spent on alcohol. And that's official numbers. And it's almost certainly the case that this is an underestimate because in a lot of societies, alcohol, because it's taxed, is part of the Black economy. So it's not captured in official statistics. So this is a lot of money to be spending on an evolutionary mistake. want to look at Canada, the country I live in right now, 2014, it's estimated that the economic costs of alcohol were $14.6 billion. It's in a country of really 30 something million people, not a very big country. Massive amounts of deaths, hours lost, years of life, productive life lost. Again, massive amount. Masturbation doesn't have an impact like that. And frankly, neither do Twinkies. And so the cost is really disproportionate for something that we're told is just a mistake. Now, it's possible that it's a mistake. It's very costly. If evolution could, it would get rid of it, but it just hasn't figured out how to do it yet. And this is possible. So evolution is constrained in various ways. It's very powerful, it can give rise to all this diversity we see in this tree. But if it doesn't have the raw materials to work on, so one potential issue is availability. So it could just be that the genetic mutation that would protect us from alcohol, that would make alcohol unpleasant to drink, that would make us not want to indulge in alcohol, just hasn't arisen yet in our gene pool. And that's possible. You need, selection can't work on variation that doesn't exist in the world. So that's one possibility. Another possibility has to do with what's called path dependence. So it's possible that because of past choices that evolution has made, it's kind of stuck with what it's got. And there's basically no way it can't start over again. It constructed a kind of neural architecture with certain reward circuits, and it's kind of stuck with that. And so there's no choice. We can't go back and start over again. And this is certainly the case in certain situations, like our lower backs. We have terrible lower backs. If you want an argument against intelligent design, look at the human lower back. And this is because it was not designed from scratch. It was hacked and adapted over the course of a long period of time from primate ancestors who lived in trees and didn't walk on 2 feet. So if you wanted to design a spine for a creature that was bipedal, as we are, you would do something really different. You would not do the back that we have, and that leads to all of our lower back problems. So this is a classic case of path dependence. It's that evolution was stuck with this thing that had already been decided for different reasons, and it can't really go back and start over again. So both of those are possibilities. So maybe evolution just doesn't have a way to fix this problem of alcohol. This actually isn't true, though. So that's a possibility, but it's not actually the case, because both genetic and cultural evolutionary solutions to the quote problem of intoxication exist. So let's talk about those. So genetic solutions first. There is a series of, actually, it's 2 separate mutations, and they're not even directly linked. So they're clearly arising together for some reason, that has appeared in different parts of the world, different periods of time. It's arisen independently at least 3 times, but the most prominent, where it's most prevalent, is in East Asia. And so it's sometimes called the Asian flushing gene. So this is a gene that interferes with our ability to metabolize alcohol. And what happens essentially is halfway through the process of metabolizing alcohol, it stops and leaves us with this very toxic intermediate substance that leads to your face turning red, feeling nausea, heart palpitations. It's very unpleasant. So people with this gene don't want to drink. They drink and they don't like it and they stop. In fact, it's so effective for this goal that chemical that reproduces this effect in otherwise genetically typical people is used as a treatment for alcoholism, quite effective treatment for alcoholism. So, we often are, when you ask the question, why do people like to drink? The answer is, well, because it makes us feel good. But that's not really a very good answer. It's just, the real question is, why does it make us feel good? And it doesn't have to make us feel good. So if you have this genetic mutation, it doesn't feel good. What's puzzling is why people who have this mutation haven't taken over the world, because they don't like to drink. They're immune to this. If alcohol is a parasite on the human mind, they're immune to this parasite. And that should be a really important adaptation. Okay, so maybe this is recent, and so it hasn't had time to spread, but that's not the case. And so we know just from genetic analysis and looking at the genetic molecular clocks, this arose in 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. in what's now Southeast China. It spread a bit to Japan and Korea and a little bit inland into North China, but it's remained very geographically constrained. And 7 to 10,000 years is a really long time. That's enough time for a genetic mutation that is useful to spread to every place where it is useful. And every place where it is useful should be anywhere that humans make alcohol. And that's everywhere. So the fact that it's just kind of sat there in East Asia and didn't go anywhere suggests that there's something else going on. We have a solution, we have a genetic solution to this problem of this parasite that supposedly takes over the human brain. And yet it hasn't taken over the world, it hasn't gone very far. So that's a genetic solution. Let's look at cultural solutions. So cultural evolution is really powerful. It's very fast. It can solve things very quickly. It can spread very quickly. The cultural solution to the problem of alcohol is prohibition. So we tend to think of, in the English-speaking world, when we talk about prohibition, we tend to think of the US in the early 20th century. But prohibition, people have been trying to ban alcohol as long as we have had alcohol. So in ancient China, some of the earliest legal codes we have are against alcohol. They are there's a statute that says anyone caught drinking will be put to death. So pretty hardcore prohibitionist policies. And yet, as far as we can tell from history, it had pretty much no effect on Chinese drinking. Chinese people continued to drink quite happily and continue to do so. So it didn't work very well. It didn't work any better than prohibition worked in the US. There are also religious groups that have banned alcohol with, again, varying success. So we tend to think of like Islam, very early in its history, decided to ban alcohol, but it was enforced kind of erratically in various periods of time, various places. If we look at the distribution, so here's the cultural silver bullet. You want to think about the Asian flushing gene as the genetic silver bullet solution to the problem. This is the cultural solution to the problem. And it's similarly, in a puzzling way, failed to take over the world. It's been around for a long time. Here's a map of currently where alcohol is prohibited, and it's not very widespread. It looks a lot like that map of where this Asian flushing gene exists. So it arose in certain places, and it never really went beyond those places. So that's puzzling too, because you would think that a culture, if alcohol only imposes costs, and they're very serious costs, and there are no benefits from an adaptive standpoint. Pleasure doesn't count. Evolution doesn't care about whether or not we're happy or experience pleasure. If there are no benefits, then these things should take off, and they don't. So this is part of the puzzle that I'm trying to explain. And so my argument in the book is that on the one hand, you have these amazing costs that we know all about. They're really terrible: chaos, individual alcoholism, physiological damage. You have these genetic, very good and effective genetic and cultural solutions to this problem, and yet they're not spreading. And so that suggests that on the other side of the calculus, you have some benefits that we don't know about, or we haven't talked about, or we haven't been clear enough about. And so the point of Drunk is to unpack what these benefits might have been in our evolutionary history, and how they might continue to be providing benefits to us today. And importantly, we have to talk about the fact that it can't be pleasure. So again, the common thing is, why do we drink? Well, because we like it, it gives us pleasure. Evolution doesn't care about pleasure. Evolutionists care if we're happy or not. So the story, if you're going to tell an evolutionary story about why we drink, this is not allowed for now. We can talk later about the importance of pleasure, because we're not our genes. We like pleasure, and our interests diverge from the interests of our genes in that regard. Like our genes, if we could be effective and pass on our genes and be miserable, that's totally fine with our genes. It's not fine with us. So there's a distinction between us and our interests and what our genetic interests are. But if we're going to tell an evolutionary story about alcohol, we have to discount pleasure. Pleasure itself is not a story. Pleasure is just something that our genes give us in return for doing things that they want us to do. So that can't be part of the story. So let's tell an evolutionary story. And to do that, we have to think about what our ecological niche is. So what are the challenges that humans face? What's unusual about us as a species? why would we as a species be distinctive in turning to alcohol where in an organized way, the way that other species have not? And we are a weird species. We're a weird ape, and we're weird in a couple different ways. And I'm gonna focus on a couple different ways, a few different ways we're weird in the book. Tonight I want to focus on just two. So one is that we are completely, utterly dependent on tools, unlike any other species. So, cheetah doesn't need to hang out with other cheetahs and strategize about how they can better catch gazelles and should they come up with some new tool. They have their teeth, they have their claws. They can get better at chasing gazelles genetically, but they don't get better culturally. And whereas humans are helpless without tools. We're so dependent on tools that we have biologically become codependent on things like fire. We could not exist without fire as a species now because our digestive system and our jaws and our teeth have changed in a way that we can't live on raw food anymore. So we're helpless without tools, and that requires constant innovation. So tools need to change. Tools need to be updated. Environments change. There are also other cultural groups out there. So even if the environment's relatively stable, we're in competition with other cultural groups that are trying to exploit the same environment. And if they have better tools than we do and they can better exploit the environment, we're in trouble. So as a species, we're dependent on tools. And this means we're very dependent on creativity. We need to be constantly innovating as a species in order to survive, unlike other species. So that's one way in which we're weird. Another way in which we're weird is that we're really dependent on each other. We are a hyper social species. We're really social compared to other primates. In fact, we look kind of more like social insects if you look at the scale on which we cooperate. And that's challenging. So we are primates, but we cooperate on a scale that if you look at the biological world looks more like ants or bees. And so the trick is how we do that. And one of the things that's required is trust. So we're unlike other primates, we engage in cooperation and in joint projects that require trust, interpersonal trust. And so this is another kind of special thing about us that you don't see in, for instance, chimpanzees or closest relatives. So these are two of the adaptive challenges that we face. Okay, let's talk about this first one, creativity. Allison Gophnick is a developmental psychologist at UC Berkeley, and she's done very interesting work on creativity in children in particular, but also looking at how this creativity changes over time. And she has this very clever, I'm not going to get into details of Blicket detecting, but it's a task that requires you, if you solve it correctly, you need to think counterintuitively. You need to think outside the box. You need to discover that this thing called a blicket is actually two different objects combined in a certain way, which is counterintuitive for most people. What she's shown is that 4-year-olds are great at this task. So 4-year-olds do solve it quite quickly. And our ability to solve it decreases almost in a linear fashion over time. So by the time that we're adults, we're not very good at solving this lateral, it's sometimes called lateral thinking task, a task where we need to connect things that are unusual or think outside of normal assumptions. What I've done in the book is lay that graph of how we do on the Blicket detection project or test with a maturation of the prefrontal cortex. So again, linear over time. So as our prefrontal cortex matures, we get worse at this lateral thinking task. We get less creative is the way to think of it. So the prefrontal cortex is part of brain, front of our brain, super important. It's the center of cognitive control, executive function, it's sometimes called. It is the center of our ability to stay focused on tasks, to delay gratification, to suppress emotions, to eliminate distractions, to really stay on, to figure out we're going for X, we're going to go for X. It allows you to move in a linear way toward your goal. And this is really important if you're going to be a functional adult. It does, though, and there's a lot of literature on this, interfere with creativity. It interferes with your ability to think laterally or outside the box. So evolution had this problem. It wants us to be creative as a species, but it also wants us to be able to tie our shoes. And so kids are great at this blicket detection task, but they suck at almost everything else, right? They can't tie their own shoes. They can't dress themselves. You ask them to do something, they forget about it. So we can't be 4-year-olds all the time. So the solution that evolution seems to have come up with is to let us be creative, let us be open and take in information for a really long time. We have an incredibly extended childhood compared to other species. And it seems to be a response to this adaptive challenge we have. We need to be creative, we need to be open minded. But at some point, we need to be able to tie our shoes and go to school on time. And so the solution is we gradually mature the prefrontal cortex. It's the last part of the brain to mature. It doesn't really reach full maturation until we're about 24 or 25. So, really quite late in life. So we get this long period where we're creative, flexible, we can think in interesting ways, but then it shuts down at a certain point because we need to also be able to focus on tasks. So that's the trade-off that evolution made. Now, what would be nice is if we could be adults, if we could still have all the knowledge that we have and all the ability to be on task and know what's important, have all those things intact, and yet temporarily be like a 4-year-old again. So one way to do it would be to zap our prefrontal cortex with a transcranial magnet, and this works. So if you hook people up to a transcranial magnet and you zap their prefrontal cortex, they're temporarily as creative as 4-year-olds are. They do just as well on a Blicket test, for instance. So we can temporarily get that creativity back through means like this. The problem with transcranial magnets is that they are a recent invention, so not available to our ancestors. They're not very acceptable to bring to parties. It's hard to dance or eat a dinner when you're hooked up to one of these things. So they're not terribly useful. They're really bulky. So what you really would want from a perspective of cultural evolution is a technology that would allow you to do that same thing, to temporarily knock out the prefrontal cortex, but do it in a low tech way. Do it in a way that with a technology that's easy to make, that everyone has access to, that is portable, that's easy to dose, maybe that something that would pair well with food and wine. Or food and wine. I give myself away. You see where I'm going. Alcohol is the low tech transcranial magnet that previous societies have realized works in terms of temporarily taking the prefrontal cortex offline. So this is one of the functions that alcohol serves for us, adaptive functions that alcohol serves. So alcohol is, in terms of the cognitive effects of alcohol, it's incredibly complicated. It's been called, Stephen Brown, the journalist, has called it a pharmacological hand grenade. So it's like meth or cocaine in that it's boosting chemicals that make us feel happy and make us feel more energetic. It's like Prozac. It's boosting serotonin levels. So it makes us feel, boosts our mood, makes us feel more optimistic about the world. It is like Valium in boosting endorphins, which again, kind of make us feel good. They blunt pain. They also make us feel bonded to other people. We feel like we like other people more. And it's like opium. So it combines the functions of all of these different substances kind of all at once and in different time sequences. They come on at different periods when after you ingest alcohol. So it's really complicated. But one of the main effects in terms of being a depressant, so it's both a stimulant and a depressive. In terms of its depressant functions, it's targeting the prefrontal cortex. The main part of the brain that it seems to shut down is the prefrontal cortex. So it's like a low-tech transcranial magnet. It's a way to get into this part of the brain and turn it down a little bit, down regulate it, but basically turn down its function a bit. And this is why then alcohol has historically in cultures around the world, this is a cross-culturally universal feature of alcohol, is associated with artists, and creativity, and new insights. So the ancient Chinese associated wine and poetry and literature. They were all part of the same package. And you see this down to the present day. So the artists, the relationship between artists and writers and poets and alcohol is a very tight one, and it's not random. There's a reason why cross-culturally this is the case, and it's because alcohol is turning us into virtual 4-year-olds temporarily, and that's a really useful function. So that's one of the functions that alcohol is performing for us. There's a lot of data on this. There's some great correlational data. This one in particular I like. So there's a study by this economist, Michael Andrews, where he looked at patent applications as a proxy of innovation. And he used US prohibition as a kind of natural experiment to see what happens when you impose prohibition. So he looked at counties that had we tend to think of prohibition as something that happened all at once when federal prohibition went into effect, but it's not the case. It was actually from the 1800s on, prohibition was getting imposed at the county. It still is. I mean, there's still dry counties, right? So it's being imposed at the county level all over the US in various ways. So he took advantage of that variation to look at the number of patent applications in counties and seeing what changed when they went from being wet, from when they were allowed to have saloons open and had social drinking, to when prohibition got imposed. And what he found was that there was a 15% drop, fairly dramatic drop in patent applications within a year after prohibition was imposed. And he found, interestingly, that over the course of about 3 years, it got back up to the same level again. So when prohibition got imposed, big drop, and then within 3 years or so, it had gotten back to the point it was before. And his explanation for this is that the saloons were shut down. People were forced to drink at home or drink in small groups in secret. And what changed was speakeasies. So speakeasies and other types of underground saloons essentially opened up, and that allowed people to start drinking socially again. So he thinks that this decline in creativity was a result of the elimination of venues for people to drink in public with one another. So that's one, it's correlational. One actually causal study that's been done is this study from 2012, where researchers got people drunk or not. So they gave people placebo drinks or drinks that actually really had alcohol, and they had a very clever way to make them indistinguishable, and measured their performance on lateral thinking tasks, on tasks where you have to kind of think outside the box. And what they found is that about 0.08 BAC, so about 2 drinks in, about when you should not drive anymore, is when you get most creative. So subjects were better able to solve these lateral thinking tasks when they reached about 0.08 BAC. So we see here there's a direct causal manipulation where we've seen getting people drunk actually demonstrably improves their ability to solve lateral thinking tasks. So there's some direct evidence for this idea that creativity. And we also have lots of evidence on the fact that when you shut down the PFC in various ways, you get more creative. There's transcranial magnets. There's looking at people who have brain damage whose PFCs are damaged. They tend to think like 4-year-olds when it comes to creativity. So there's a lot of good data on this. I presented that 2012 study years ago. My first book is called Trying Not to Try, and it's about this early Chinese idea of wu wei, or effortless action, and how the spontaneousness and being in the zone is related to creativity. And I presented that 2012 study as a way of showing that kind of artificial ways of getting to spontaneity might have the same effect. And the first person in the Q&A session to raise their hand said, "Hey, do you know about the Balmer peak?" So this is supposedly, I don't know if it's true or not, maybe apocryphal, but this idea that Steve Ballmer, the former CEO of Microsoft, discovered that his coding, as he drank, his coding ability dropped slightly, and then there's a sweet spot where suddenly it spiked. And he had there's a spot where he was an awesome coder, and then you go a little bit beyond that and it collapses again. And supposedly he would keep himself at this BAC, blood alcohol content level, by having an IV drip hooked up to him. So he would get just the right amount of alcohol into his system to stay at that 0.129 level for hours and hours so he could code. And this is from XCKD, this is very funny cartoonist. And he makes fun of this. So he says, it's a very delicate effect. You have to calibrate. You can't just give a team of coders a year's supply of whiskey and tell them to get cracking. Has this ever happened? And they makes fun of Windows operating system. But in fact, this is actually more or less what Google does. So this talk was at a Google campus. And after these people told me about the Balmer Peak in the Q&A session, the first place they took me on the tour of the campus was their whiskey room. So they have this room they go to that's got wall to wall, amazing, really amazing single malt scotches. And when they run into a problem, when they run into a challenge that they can't kind of force their way through, they, instead of sitting in front of their computers and kind of banging their heads against it, they go to this room and they pour themselves a little bit of scotch. They have beanbag chairs and a foosball table, and they just kind of hang out and sip a little bit of scotch and chat. And often they come up with a solution to the problem. So this is one of the motivations for writing this book, actually, was this experience of seeing in person how a very successful organization like Google is using alcohol in a very controlled way, in a limited way, as a tool to solve certain problems. And it occurred to me that cultures are probably doing that too. Successful cultures are doing that. So that's the first problem that we face, is creativity, and alcohol can be a help in meeting that challenge. The second problem we have is trust. How do we cooperate as inherently suspicious primates who are concerned primarily genetically for our kin and people we can keep track of? How do we cooperate with strangers is really the problem. And the best way to see this problem is to think about certain cooperation dilemmas that we face in especially large scale societies. And these go from, they have a variety of names: prisoner's dilemma, common goods problems, tragedy of the commons. There's a lot of different ways to refer to this, but the structure is the same in all these cases. So you get the best payoff if you cooperate. So every individual does the best if all the individuals cooperate. That's the best solution. The problem is if you cooperate and the person you're cooperating with doesn't cooperate, you're screwed. So they get all the payoff and you get zero payoff. And that's a very bad situation. So you don't want to be taken advantage of in a prisoner's dilemma situation. So a classic example of one of these is I think it's something like tuna fishing. So the tuna stock is depleted. Everyone agrees that we would all be better off. All of us tuna fishermen would be better off if we just didn't fish this year. We need to take a year off, let the tuna replenish themselves, and then in the long run, all of us individually will be better off. The problem is if I say, yeah, that's right, I'll take the year off, and then my buddy goes out and fishes without me knowing it and takes all the tuna, then I'm really screwed. He's getting the 5 and I'm getting 0. And that's the danger in these type of cooperation dilemmas. We have to trust other people, and we have to trust them because we're vulnerable to really being taken advantage of. And so rational agents, so people who are, if you're doing this as a rational agent and you're trying to think what's the best strategy in a prisoner's dilemma or public goods game, the best strategy is to go out and just get the 5 if you can. Go out and get as many tuna as you can, because you can't trust that other people are not going to be fishing. And the result is that we destroy the tuna fishery, and and everyone ends up with 1. Everyone ends up with this kind of suboptimal outcome. But it's because we can't trust one another. If we could trust one another, we could solve this problem. In real life, people solve prisoner dilemma situations all the time. So in fact, we face them and we are able to solve them, and we're able to solve them without external things like treaties and enforcement mechanisms. We solve them through trust. We solve them through emotions. So people have a sense of honor, people trust one another, people love one another. So we don't tend to think this way, but you have prisoner's dilemma situations in romantic relationships. We love and trust and honor each other, and that binds us to other people in a way that keeps us from pursuing our own narrowly selfish interests. It binds us to other people in a way that allows us to not only cooperate intuitively and spontaneously, but also to trust other people because we can see when other people feel that same way about us. So emotions are the solution to prisoner dilemma situations. This is why humans not only have certain types of emotions, social emotions, it's why we're very attentive to emotional expressions in other people, because emotions are the solution to the problem, and therefore emotional expressions in other people's faces, their body language, can serve as a signal to other people that we're really in love, that we're really honorable, that we really are a good friend, and we really care about them. And so people are paying a lot of attention to facial expressions in situations where they're worried about cooperation, where they're worried about trusting other people. And we're tending to look for examples of spontaneous gestures that are hard to control. So a classic example of this is the Duchenne versus the not Duchenne smile. So that on the left here is the Duchenne smile. It's the genuine smile that you have when you are really amused, you're really happy, you really find something enjoyable. On the right is the smile that you make when you're trying to be nice. It's not as nice an expression. These are controlled by completely different muscle systems. The one on the left is controlled by it's an automatic reaction. It's not something you can typically control rationally. The one on the right, this non-Duchenne smile, you can think of it as a PFC, a prefrontal cortex smile. It's a smile that's commanded by the prefrontal cortex. It says, this person, you want them to like you, smile and be nice. That's what you get. We don't like that smile. We like the one on the left. We like the one that is not typically under control. Actors and people who get good at controlling this can do it, but it's hard. It's hard to do. That's why it's hard to smile naturally for a picture, because it's hard to smile naturally on command. We're focused when we're worried about trust and cooperation. We're focusing on facial expressions that are hard to fake and are hard to produce on command, because the PFC, we're a little worried about the PFC. We're worried about the PFC because it's the center of lying. It's the center of really being only concerned about yourself and your own interests. Now, the problem is, so we're relying on these signals. We can tell a Duchenne smile from a non-Duchenne smile, but that's going to create a kind of arms race. So you're going to get a pressure for people to be able, because the payoff, if you can fake a Duchenne smile and fake trustworthiness and have someone trust you, and then you can sneak out in the middle of the night and fish up all the tuna. That's, from an evolutionary perspective, that's a successful strategy in some ways. And so there's going to be pressure on people to be able to fake sincerity, to fake honest, these things that are normally honest signals. But that's going to then create a pressure to detect faking. So we're going to get better at seeing through fake emotional expressions, telling Duchenne from non-Duchenne smiles. It's very similar. The dynamics here are very similar to what you see between predator and prey species. So gazelles get faster, and that puts pressure on the cheetah to get faster. So the cheetahs get faster, and then that creates pressure for the gazelles to get faster. And the end result of that is these really freakishly fast species. When you look at these things running across the savannah, it's like, why are they so fast? It seems like such a waste. It's a waste of energy, but it's a waste of energy that they're stuck with because they have to keep up this pace. They have to keep evolving in this arms race. And the same thing is true of humans. We have this freakishly good, compared to other primates, we have this freakishly good ability to fake emotions, to lie, to make things up. But we also have this freakishly good ability to see through that. We're really good at reading emotions in other people's faces in a way that would seem supernatural to a chimpanzee. the way in which we can read each other's minds. So there is this arm race. Now, what's important to realize is that cultures are not neutral bystanders in this arm race. We want the cheetah to win. We want the cheater detector to win because it's in society's interest if we keep the tuna stock healthy, if we figure out who the cheaters are and we don't cooperate with them anymore. And so we want to put our finger on the scale and weigh it in favor of the cheater detectors. So how do we do that? Well, the prefrontal cortex is the cheater's friend. Prefrontal cortex is crucial for lying, for planning, for calculating your own individual self-interest. Interestingly enough, that's more intuitive, I think, for most people. Interestingly enough, it also, when your prefrontal cortex is fully online, you're worse at detecting lies. And this is kind of counterintuitive. You'd think you'd be kind of sharper and better able to detect lies, but lies are hard to detect. And lie detection seems to be one of those things that we're better at when we're not trying to do it. It seems to be we're better at it when we kind of are relaxed and just looking at a wide bandwidth of cues rather than trying to think, is this person lying or not? So the PFC actually interferes with lie detection. So what's the cultural solution to aiding the cheater detectors and hampering the cheaters? It's our good friend alcohol. So alcohol is targeting the prefrontal cortex. It's down regulating it. It's making it work less efficiently. And so it's both simultaneously giving the cheetah a little extra speed. The cheetah is better at detecting liars because it's not focused on it consciously, and so it's going to do a better job. And at the same time, it's slowing down the gazelle. It's making it harder to lie, and so it's slowing down the gazelle and making the gazelle easier to catch. And so this is one of the functions of alcohol in this trust situation where we want to get people to trust one another. On top of all that, which is a kind of nice side effect, is that alcohol is boosting serotonin. And there's a pretty good body of experimental evidence that if you pump people full of serotonin in various ways, you nasally inject them with serotonin, they just don't want to cheat anymore in public goods games. They just kind of have this expansive feeling of happiness, and they tend to want to cooperate more than they would if their serotonin levels were lower. So it's helping in that regard as well. So there's a variety of ways in which it's encouraging cooperation and making it harder for people who are not cooperative to do well. So one way to look at this is, when we meet, many cultures have something similar to this, where you meet, and in Europe-derived cultures, you shake hands. What you're doing when you shake hands, the origin of this is you're showing that you don't have a weapon. We meet and I'm a little worried about you stabbing me. And so you put you're dominant. Most people are right-handed. You put your right hand out to show that you're not holding a weapon. Sitting down and doing shots with someone before negotiating a treaty is the cognitive equivalent of shaking hands. You're taking your prefrontal cortex out and you're saying, I no longer have cognitive control. I am mentally disarmed. You can trust me. And so that's one of the things that alcohol is doing for people. And a good, my favorite kind of illustration of this is from this TV show, Game of Thrones. I'm going to show you a brief clip from that. Is it working?
Doesn't look to be playing on our end.
Yeah. For some reason on the screen share, it's not playing. Let's see if I do it. Click on it. No. All right. The scene from this works on my computer, but apparently not on screen share. Game of Thrones, it's the famous red wedding scene. And so banquet scene, everyone's so these two potentially hostile groups are celebrating this treaty. They've decided to cooperate. We're going to work together, even though we didn't trust each other before. We have common interests. We're going to work together. And it's sealed by this wedding between the two groups. And so here's the banquet where everyone's celebrating and everyone's getting drunk. And Lord Bolton, who's sitting at the table with these two, the server comes to fill his wine glass and he puts his hand over it and says, no, I don't want any wine. And his companions look at him and say, what, you don't drink? And he says, no, it dulls the senses. And this guy to the right, the guy is very cheerfully getting drunk, says, well, that's the point. And they kind of laugh. Of course, Lord Bolton, people who watch the show will know, is not drinking because he is masterminding the massacre of everyone who's sitting around him. So he's going to have everyone killed in about 10 minutes. So that's why he's not drinking. He's trying to keep his senses sharp because he doesn't want to mentally disarm, because he's not trustworthy. He's not taking his prefrontal cortex out the same way everyone else is. And so this is why people use alcohol in these kind of social situations where you need to learn to trust one another. And this has been true throughout history and cross-culturally. So ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China, ancient Greece, no treaty is signed, and no potentially hostile group of people come to any kind of agreement without massive quantities of alcohol. And this is true to the present day. So Nixon, when he tried to basically reestablish relationships with China, apparently said to his Chinese counterpart, if we drink enough Mao Tai, this sorghum liquor, anything is possible. So people disarming themselves cognitively is one of the ways in which alcohol is allowing us to get past these trust issues. It also, downregulating the prefrontal cortex does so it prevents lying, it makes it easier to detect liars. It also boosts our feeling of groupishness. It makes us like other people that we're with more. So, and that has to do with this boosting of things like endorphins. It's making us feel good. It's making us feel bonded to other people. It's making us relaxed. It's making us feel more attractive. It's making us think that other people are more attractive. So it has all these kind of pro-social functions where it's helping people get past individual inhibitions and maybe individual dislikes or hangups about other people through boosting these kind of love chemicals, these kind of bonding chemicals that we normally get, like mothers and infants have or lovers have with one another. We get a little bit of this when we drink alcohol. And so this is why it's been such an important social lubricant. It's not a myth that alcohol serves as a social lubricant. It really does, and for very good biological reasons. This is why organizations use alcohol as a bonding technique. So, office parties are in ill repute right now. There's a lot of problems with office parties. They can go seriously awry. And yet they do serve a function, getting people together in a non-work environment and down-regulating the prefrontal cortices and boosting their endorphins and serotonin is helpful if your goal is to increase a sense of groupishness, a sense of being bonded to other people. This can go awry, as in the very famous The Office Party movie from some years back, where the cocaine slides full of cocaine are probably overkill. You probably don't need to go that far. So this can obviously go too far, and obviously there are dangers involved, and yet there's good empirical evidence that this actually works. So there's empirical evidence that if you put people around a table, you give them a task, you have a placebo condition where they think they're drinking, but they're not drinking alcohol, and the other one, they are drinking alcohol, they like each other more. They report feeling connected to one another more. They like each other more. They rate each other more positively on personality traits than they do otherwise. And they just enjoy each other's company more. And so there's something to alcohol that allows you to bind people together into cooperative groups in a way that's not possible when they're completely sober. And that's these people on the right. So you see, notice all the Duchenne smiles, right? These are people in the alcohol condition. And they're at about 0.08. So that seems to be, again, around the point at which people, alcohol is having this effect without really plunging us into dark stuff, which happens at higher BAC levels. These functions, these social functions of alcohol also explain some otherwise puzzling things, like why Skype didn't eliminate business travel. So Jules Verne, back in the 1800s, predicted that there would be video technologies. He called it the phonotelephone or something. And he predicted that that would mean people would never travel anymore because they could just communicate with each other remotely. And the same prediction was made when we had things like Skype. So when Skype was invented, I'm old enough to remember this quite clearly, everyone said, that's it, business travel is going to stop, because why would you fly to Shanghai to have terrible jet lag, be in a plane for this long time, be away from your family? to sign a contract with people when you could just do it over Skype. Why would you do that? And yet, business travel until COVID hit, business travel remained pretty much unchanged. People still flew to Shanghai. And they flew to Shanghai because if you're going to sign a complicated contract or a high stakes contract for anything more complicated than just producing paper clips, there's so many contracts can only cover so much. You have to trust the other party, and you don't trust another party unless you go there, you shake their hand, and you sit down for a meal. But it's never just a meal. It's a meal that includes usually really copious quantities of alcohol. This is why people travel for business, and this is why I predict that once COVID-19 is passed, we've all gotten used to Zoom. We're doing this kind of crazy. I mean, I'm sitting in this weird hotel room in San Antonio. I don't know where any of you are. This is just bizarre, right? We would normally all be together in the bookstore. We would have been drinking wine, continue drinking wine. That's what people want, and that's what people feel comfortable with, and that's what we're going to start doing again once COVID is gone. So I predict business. So sell your Zoom stock and buy United stock or something. So things are gonna bump back to where they were before. I would predict for this reason among others. So if you're talking about balancing out costs and benefits, we know what the costs are. There are these enormous costs to alcohol, both individually and socially, but there are also these benefits. And the fact that the costs have remained around, the fact that our taste for alcohol has remained in our gene pool and remained a cultural option when there are other cultural options available, it's really puzzling. And the only explanation for that is that there are adaptive benefits, countervailing adaptive benefits that have basically been paying for alcohol, that have been paying for the costs, that have been countervailing that. And so this is the point of the book, is to walk through these various benefits, the creativity, trust. I talk about a few others, helping us to deal with the burdens of consciousness, for instance, is one of them. But there have been these adaptive functions in our history, and that's why alcohol has been so important for human beings. So we've been drinking alcohol for basically as long as we've been doing anything as an organized species. So this is from about 20,000 years ago, stone carving from Southwest France. Uh, Fertility goddess, maybe it's a female figure, maybe could just be pornography. I mean, archaeologists always want to think there's some deep religious thing going on. This could have just been something a teenager had under his bed. But in any case, this is a figure of either reverence or desire. And one commentary I read said, well, she's blowing a horn to summon the spirits or whatever. If she's using that as a musical instrument, she's got it the wrong way around. And so clearly she's not using it as a musical instrument. She's got the wide end near her mouth. She's drinking something. What is she drinking? We don't know. But I'd be really surprised if the artist who made this thought it was important to document her drinking water to slake her thirst. She's drinking something special. It's alcohol, or it's some kind of hallucinogenic beverage. It's an intoxicant of some kind. So this is 20,000 years ago. This important figure is drinking some sort of intoxicant. This is a site called Göbekli Tepe from what's present-day Turkey, from probably about 12,000 years ago. And we have hunter-gatherers here, so there's no agriculture yet. Hunter-gatherers are gathering and building these really impressive ritual sites and engaging in days-long feasts and religious rituals, fueled almost certainly by large quantities of beer and probably hallucinogen laced beer. So we know we have direct evidence of beer making from this region from about 13,000 years ago. And this is before agriculture. So the standard story we've been told about alcohol, again, it goes along with the whole evolutionary mistake story, is we figured out agriculture, and then sometime after that, someone left some sourdough starter out for too long, and it started to ferment, and we were like, oh, that's interesting, and we drank that, and hey, we have beer now. So it's a kind of byproduct of agriculture. The fact that hunter-gatherers, were gathering and doing serious group work and group ritual activities before agriculture, but they were drinking intoxicants, has suggested to a lot of archaeologists that it's the other way around, So this is a so-called beer before bread hypothesis, that it was actually the desire for alcohol that drove us to start settling down and growing crops seriously. This is not just the case in the Fertile Crescent, where we're talking about grain and beer, but you see this in lots of other places in the world. People seem to be cultivating crops for intoxicating beverages or for intoxicating smokes, things that you could smoke, before they were growing it for food. And so, if this is true, and this seems to be the balance of the evidence, our desire for intoxication actually gave rise to civilization in an important way. It drove us to start settling down and living in sedentary groups. And so, it's not, our taste for alcohol is not some kind of random byproduct of civilization. It actually drove the creation of civilization. This is why you see alcohol and other intoxicants at the center of every civilization, almost every civilization we know of. And civilizations that don't have alcohol are substituting some other intoxicant. They're substituting kava or hallucinogen laced tobacco, the cannabis sometimes. It's usually alcohol though. So it's very, cultures that don't use alcohol are very rare. But it's revealing that in cultures that don't use alcohol, they're substituting another chemical intoxicant that's serving exactly the same social functions. And so this is in a very important way, intoxication and civilization are bound together in a very basic sense. This is why during COVID-19 lockdown, so COVID-19 hit, there's a lot of debate about what do we shut down, what remains open, are golf courses, essential services, or gun shops, essential services. There's a lot of debate about certain things. What no one ever debated was liquor stores. Liquor stores remained open. Liquor stores were an essential service. And this is revealing. It's revealing that in the same way that grocery stores are essential, we need access to chemical intoxicants, and humans realize that at some implicit level. So I think this is very revealing, and it's because they're doing this work for us. They have been responsible for helping these very fiercely individual primates, which is what we are. We're biologically in a lot of ways similar to chimpanzees, but we figured out a way to live together in these large groups and cooperate in ways that look a lot more like social insects, like bees or ants. We cooperate in these really selfless ways that are it would be shocking to see chimpanzees cooperating in this way. And there are a lot of tools. I mean, we've adapted biologically in some ways to do this, but there are cultural tools that we use as well, especially to make the transition from small scale societies to large scale societies. Religion is one of them, and alcohol is another. And often it helps to just throw the two of them in at the same time. We often do both at once, right? Because they both are doing similar things. So my argument in the book is this: we have to see, if we want to think about alcohol and other chemical intoxicants in intelligent fashion, we need to understand the functions that they've served historically for human beings. And those do have a dark side. So in the last chapter, I turned to talking about what I call the dark side of Dionysus. So Dionysus is the Greek god of wine, very important god of creativity and all these wonderful things, of bonding in certain ways. But Dionysus is dangerous. Dionysus has a dark side. Dionysus can give you a gift. Dionysus is the god who gave Midas the golden touch. So you want gold? Okay, I'll give you the golden touch. And that turns out to not work very well. It had these very bad consequences. So he could give gifts that were gifts, but they also were curses. They have both aspects. His followers were these maenads, these women who would supposedly meet in the wilderness and drink and engage in these bacchanalian festivities, but also tear apart any random person who wandered across them in the woods. So they were very dangerous and bloodthirsty. So Dionysus has always had this kind of a dark side as well, in addition to the benefits. And we have to realize that for all these benefits of alcohol, there are dark sides. So, positive bonding, liking, feeling attracted to other people and feeling more attractive yourself is great. There are dark sides to this kind of alcohol fueled bonding, this kind of tribalism and bro culture, and kind of the way it's used in fraternities can be really dysfunctional. And so there's this dark side when you create a bonded in group, when you make people feel better about each other. you almost inevitably create an outgroup. And so that's a danger. You also have to worry about, so I use the example of Lord Bolton, who's not drinking because he's an evil defector who's going to kill everyone at the banquet he's sitting with. But what if Lord Bolton is a Muslim? So he's not drinking just because his religion says he can't drink. What if he is a pregnant woman and doesn't want to drink for that reason? What if he is a recovering alcoholic? What if he has to get up early the next morning to take his kids to daycare and just can't drink because he needs to get up at 5 in the morning? There are a lot of maybe he just doesn't like to drink. So the other danger, it's not just that alcohol-based bonding is creating outgroups. The other danger is it's freezing out people who don't drink. And it's creating this unfair advantage for people who are engaged in that bonding that gives them an advantage over people who, for very good reasons, don't want to or can't engage in that bonding. This is a problem that we need to, as a society, talk about and confront. But I think that prohibition isn't the right solution. It's figuring out how to try to level the playing field between drinkers and non-drinkers. Um, and of course, the way we use alcohol in our private social lives can be wonderful. It can enhance intimacy. It can help new romantic or even established romantic couples get past inhibitions, get past awkwardness, and enjoy themselves. It can also lead to bar fights, right? All sorts of violence can lead to domestic violence and sexual assault. It has disinhibiting the human brain. There's a reason we have the prefrontal cortex. It's a really expensive organ. It evolved for a very good reason. You don't want to be taking it down too low, and you don't want to be taking it down too often. And you want to be worried about the consequences when individuals are doing this, especially if they're doing it with distilled liquors and in a way that's not socially supervised. And so in this final chapter, I talk about this, the dangers of alcohol, but also the fact that alcohol, we need to be more concerned about the dangers because alcohol is actually more dangerous now than it's ever been in our history. And that's because alcohol has traditionally come with two built-in safety features that in the modern world we've disabled. We've turned off the airbags, if you want to think about it that way. So the first of these is just natural limits on alcohol strength. So if we're talking about natural fermentation, so just putting yeast in a liquid with sugars, carbohydrates, are going to turn them into alcohol. There's a limit to how strong that alcohol can get. And so with naturally occurring yeast, kind of the yeast that we had historically, if you're making a beer, so you're making something out of grain, you're going to get like a 2 to 3% beer. So that's what we evolved. Most cultures were drinking 2 to 3% beers. And that's pretty light beer. So it'll get you a little bit buzzed, but not too drunk. You'd have to drink a lot of it to get seriously drunk. Even if we were making fruit wines with the yeast we had available, it wasn't getting a very strong wine. So maybe 7, 8, 9. So by Napa standards, kind of not something that would pass muster. We've domesticated yeast. Yeast are probably the oldest domesticated animal that humans have. We've been working on yeast because we've been so interested in alcohol for such a long time. We've been focusing on getting yeast to be better. And so this is really about when yeast kind of punk out. So they're converting sugars to alcohol, to ethanol. That's going to start shutting at a certain point that starts to shut them down. So they're resistant to alcohol, but they're not completely immune to alcohol. And so that usually used to happen at a lower rate. We've bred really strong yeast. And so now we can get really strong beers. I don't know, we can get beers like 8, 9% now. And wines, I hope no one in Napa is doing this, but certainly in Australia, they make wines that get up to like 16, even maybe 17% ABV. These kind of wines, you open them up and it scalds your face with alcoholic fumes. It's not my favorite style of wine. But so you can push yeast. You can breed them to be hardier. You can push them as far as you can push them. Give them the most sugar-laden fruit you can give them. They're not going to get above 16% ABV. And it's this natural break. It's kind of natural safety feature in alcoholic beverages. All of this changes. So yeah, alcohol, we can get up to these really strong Syrahs. All of this changes when we can start doing distillation on a large scale. So distillation is a way around the natural limitations of yeast. So what you do is you take an alcoholic mixture of some kind, so it's weak, it's at the level that yeast can produce, and you heat it up. And so ethanol is a very volatile molecule. It's going to boil off first. If you can capture that vapor and turn it back into a liquid and capture it, you've got more or less pure ethanol. You can't quite, it's never completely pure, but you can get in the 90s, and vodkas come in at 90% ABV. So you can go from, imagine just the leap. So the leap from like a 8% fruit wine made with naturally occurring yeast to a 16% Australian Shiraz, that's a pretty big jump. You're doubling the alcohol content. But when you go to like 90 something percent vodka or a cognac where you're distilling that wine, that's crazy strong. It's so much stronger than the stuff we've been evolved to deal with. Now, and the thing is, it's a relatively recent invention, and not a lot of people realize this. So, distillation, the concept of distillation is pretty simple and has been understood for a long time. So, Aristotle described how you would distill alcohol. The problem is it's technologically kind of difficult to pull off. You have to have metallurgy, or glass blowing. You have to be able to heat things and keep them at a pretty constant temperature. You need to be able to keep liquids and gases under pressure without things exploding. So it's actually really difficult to pull off in practice. And so we didn't have distillation on a large scale until probably the 1300s in China and 1600s in Europe, which seems like a long time ago. So when I tell people this, it's been, hundreds of years, few hundred years since we've had, that seems like a really long time. But on an evolutionary time scale, it's nothing. So our first primate ancestors adapted to alcohol containing fruit. So fruit that just kind of fell on the ground and started to ferment about 10 million years ago. So we first developed the enzymes to break down alcohol in our bodies about 10 million years ago. Then you look at, at the very end of that time scale is when you get modern humans arising. So about 200,000 years ago, we got modern humans. At the very end of that time scale, you get people starting to make alcohol in a serious way. And I have here indirect evidence of beer wine production. We actually have some now direct evidence of beer wine production back to 13,000 years ago. So 13,000 years ago, we started producing alcohol in a serious way. Where did we start distilling things? Maybe 500 years ago, 600 years ago, 700 years ago at the most. On an evolutionary time scale, that's a blip. It's not a very long time compared to how long we've been developing drinking alcohol. Compared to when we developed these enzymes for the Asian flushing syndrome, it's 7 to 10,000 years ago. So it's possible that we just haven't, genetic and cultural evolution haven't had time to catch up to the unique danger that distilled liquors present. They're so much stronger than beers and wines. It's considered the same drug because it's just ethanol. It is the same drug in some sense, but it's such a much more powerful dose of ethanol that I really think distilled liquors should be considered a completely different drug. You can't, drinking a 2 to 3% wine, it's really hard. You can't kill yourself. You just can't drink that much that fast. It's a volume to stomach volume problem. But drinking vodka, you can pass out, you can drink so much that you stop breathing, and you can do that pretty quickly. And so distilled liquors are scary things, and it's a problem we haven't had to deal with until relatively recently. So that's one of the airbags that's been disabled, the natural limits. The other one is that historically, drinking has always been a social thing. So we've always done drinking in a public communal setting that was ritually regulated. So in ancient Greece, for instance, the symposium where people would meet to socialize over wine was overseen by a symposiarch, someone who controlled the pace of the drinking. They would control the wine to water ratio. So they would water things down a bit more if they were getting out of hand. They would keep it stronger if they needed to move things along. In ancient China, and even to the present day, you don't drink until someone toasts. So you have alcohol at your side, but you don't just sit there drinking it. You drink when someone proposes a toast, and only certain people have the right to propose toast. And so there are a variety of ways in which human beings regulate drinking, even in very informal situations. If you're doing it social, if you're drinking socially, you're regulating yourself socially. And you think about even just going to the pub, which seems really informal. You order rounds if you're drinking with people, right? Everyone gets their drink, and if you finish yours really fast, you got to wait. You got to drink some water until everyone's ready to order another round. So we regulate each other when we're drinking communally. What's really new for human beings is being able to go to a drive-through liquor store and have them load up your trunk with a couple cases of vodka and a bunch of firearms and pornography and Twinkies, and just drive home and have all that at your disposal at home without any kind of social regulation. This is a completely new phenomenon. And I think we've seen the dangers of this. We've had this danger for a while. I think COVID-19 has really exacerbated this. So lockdowns where people are stuck in their homes, maybe with family members, sometimes alone. People get involved in really unhealthy drinking practices. And this is because of this removal of social control. And so I call this in the book, the two banes of civilization are distillation and isolation. We're drinking distilled liquors, which are really dangerous, and we're drinking them alone. We're drinking them outside of social control. And both of those make alcohol much more dangerous than it's historically been for human beings. So what do we do about this? There's a whole literature on harm reduction strategies when it comes to alcohol. One just very basic thing is don't drink alone, or try not to drink alone. Drink with other people, because that will regulate you, it will distract you, it will help. It's the way we were evolved to drink. It's that's where you get the positive functions of alcohol is in social situations. You can be more mindful of your drinking. So Rosamund Dean has this book called Mindful Drinking, where she points out that we often drink in a habitual way. So we come home from work and we pour ourselves a glass of wine, and we don't even think about if we want a glass of wine. That's what you do when you come home from work. And if we actually stop and think, do I want this glass of wine? We might sometimes say, no, actually, I'm going to go walk the dog instead, or I'll wait until dinner. So just being more conscious of our drinking can help us regulate our drinking in various ways. And there are also ways in which we can use non-alcoholic, alcohol-like beverages to get some of the same effects. You do get a placebo effect from mocktails and things like that. So this might be a way to harness some of the cognitive effects of alcohol without the harmful physiological effects of alcohol. There are a variety of strategies I talk about in the last chapter of the book. There are also really basic public policy things that I just think should be implemented right away. So I was all through undergrad and grad school, I lived in San Francisco, and I worked in the restaurant industry. I worked in bars and restaurants. And at least back then, I made an alternate minimum wage. I think I was paid like $1.86 an hour because I got tips. But that meant that I was completely dependent on tips for my income. And how do you get tips? How do you raise the amount of tips you get? You get people drunk. People drinking, it bumps up their tab. Drunk people tip better. It was in my interest to let people get as drunk as they wanted to get. And that's not healthy, because ideally, servers, bartenders, cocktail servers should be functioning something like the symposiarch in a Greek festival. They should be monitoring alcohol intake. And the way we pay people in the service industry in the United States is not healthy. We're actually hampering them because we're giving them the incentive system is such that they can't perform their job properly. So I think if you actually paid people in the service industry a real hourly wage, so they weren't totally dependent on tips, drunk driving would be halved the following year. So this seems like a no-brainer. So in places like Europe, Canada is more like the States in this regard. But in Europe, at least, people make an actual honest hourly wage, and they can tell people no. They can cut people off when they need to. So that seems like a no-brainer to me. If you're seriously worried about the harms of alcohol, if you're serious about drunk driving and all these other things, this is like an easy policy solution. So in the conclusion of the book, I talk about this myth. So the first account we have of Dionysus in Greek mythology is from this Homeric hymn from the 7th century. And it's about these pirates who are traveling the coast looking for plunder, and they notice this very handsome, well-dressed young man standing on the shore, and they decide they're going to kidnap him because they'll get a good ransom for him. And so they go in to capture him, and when they meet him, it's only one person, the tiller, the helmsman, says, "No, this is not a good idea. This guy, this is a god. This guy is someone special. Let's leave him alone." But the other pirates ignore him, and so they capture this young man who it turns out is Dionysus in disguise. And things immediately start to go wrong. So they get him on the ship, and they start sailing, and then the sea turns to wine, and the mast starts sprouting leaves, and grapes turns into a grapevine, and then Dionysus himself turns into a lion and starts chasing the pirates. And they jump into the sea and are turned into dolphins and swim away and are stuck in dolphin form for the rest of their lives. Only the tiller is spared because he recognized Dionysus and realized who he was. And he's blessed by Dionysus, and the hymn tells us goes on to live this very long and prosperous life because he's been blessed by the god. So what are the take homes from this myth? Why do I like this myth? We need to, if we are not going to be animals, if we're going to be humans, we need to recognize Dionysus. We need to recognize the power of Dionysus, the function of Dionysus, and also the dangers of Dionysus, the fact that there's dark sides of Dionysus. If we can do this, we can incorporate Dionysus into our lives in the way that we need to. And so the end of the hymn, they say, only by knowing you, Dionysus, can we create sweet song. And I think the idea behind that is only by incorporating ecstasy, incorporating the kind of release from the self, the release from the prefrontal cortex that we need to have to be creative, to be trustworthy, to trust people, to bond with other people. This is the only way we can continue to be successful. And we are successful. We are the most successful primate there is. But it's partly because we've learned how to incorporate Dionysus successfully into our lives. So that's it. Thanks a lot. And I will now try to figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Edward. What a
Thanks.
fascinating talk. So we are at just about 8:30. If anybody has any questions, there's nothing in the chat box, but you're welcome to unmute yourself. We have time for just maybe one or two quick questions. If anybody has anything, I'll wait a few seconds to see if anybody pops up. Ryan, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, thanks so much to Napa Bookmind for putting this on, and you, Edward, for the past hour and a half doing the deep dive into the book. I mean, you're the author, knowing what you know. What kind of questions would you have? You know, had you not even read your book yet? In my case, I still I just picked up my copy today from Green Apple here in San Francisco.
Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that is still in business. I love that bookstore. Yeah, I mean, why do people not focus more on the positive functions of alcohol would be one of my questions. And there's not a good answer to that. I think there's this odd puritanism or kind of discomfort with intoxicants that you see in academic discourse to this day that I think has created this blind spot. We're just not good at talking about the benefits of alcohol because there's almost kind of squeamishness about it.
What's your own personal benefit? What does alcohol do most for you?
Certainly the creativity thing. So when I wrote the proposal for this book, I went through a bunch of different versions of it and they weren't working. My agent kept telling me, yeah, it's not right yet. And she was right. It wasn't, I had all the information there, but it wasn't popping. And I realized I hadn't taken my own advice. I actually hadn't written any of it drunk. And so I went out, I was at this hotel. I was supposed to meet with some colleagues in the evening. And I went down, I had about an hour and a half, and I went down to the hotel bar with my laptop and had a Negroni. And by the end of that first Negroni, actually the first page of the book the present book, it's the first page of the proposal, appeared to me. Like it really almost felt like I was taking dictation. So I use it sometimes when the same way the Google coders are using it. When I run into a wall and I need some kind of lateral thinking breakthrough, I find it really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I like the Negroni as opposed to the Google coders who might, be like microdosing or something like that, right?
Yeah, no, that's another. I talk a little bit about microdosing as well. That may be a way to get the same effect in a way that's less harmful than alcohol. But I don't think we know enough about microdosing.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I was wondering if you had any predictions on the next shift in kind of drinking culture.
Yeah, that might one shift might be the replacement of alcohol. So hallucinogens, psychedelics have always been too powerful to use on a regular basis like that. They've always been ones, like Michael Pollan's book on psychedelics recently. They really radically shake up your mind, but they produce insights that are often like way out in left field and often not useful. But we have the technology now to produce psychedelics in precisely calibrated doses that might make them more usable. So that might be, the next phase might be microdosing. I think it's such a new thing. We don't know much about it.
For sure. Very interesting. Thanks. I'll give the floor to somebody else. Appreciate it, Edward.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And glad you got it from Green Apple, a really great bookstore as well.
Yeah.
So if nobody else has popped on, and we are at 8:30, so unless somebody really quick wants to pop on, give you a couple seconds.
Yeah, sorry, this is the first time I gave that talk, so my timing was not great. I apologize.
It's okay. It ran a little long. Luckily, it was very interesting.
Yeah, okay.
If it was really boring, I would have found a way to cut you off.
Yeah, okay, good. All right, thanks.
Time for one more, maybe?
Yeah, go for it.
I've spent my whole life working in the beverage alcohol industry. So some of these things are quite challenging to everything I've ever read up until, your book, which I'm very excited to dive into. So has anybody else kind of challenged you on some of this stuff that you've published, or is everybody nodding their heads to it?
I've gotten a fair amount of pushback. So, Julian Bagini in the Wall Street Journal gave me a very mixed review. He thinks I really underestimate the dangers of alcohol. And one of my good friends, Randy Nesse, who's a evolutionary medical researcher at ASU, read the book and he really had mixed feelings. He was like, I see your point about these positive functions. I know what you're saying, but he spent his whole career treating alcoholics. And so he just said, I've seen up close so much harm and pain that I can't go with you there. Like, I just don't, he's really at the end of the day, a prohibitionist. He really thinks we should get rid of alcohol entirely. So I think that people who have a lot of clinical experience with alcoholism or personal experience with alcoholism are going to tend to be a little bit less receptive to some of these messages.
Absolutely.
Anything you want to end on, Edward?
Yeah, well, I think so. These are complicated issues, right? Distillation and the social isolation, drinking, really can change the calculus. And so I'm not really at the end of the book, I'm not saying we definitely should be using alcohol all the time, in every social situation. The important thing is that to make an intelligent decision, we need to have all the information at our disposal. And up until now, the way the calculus has been is here are all the costs. We know what all the costs are. What are the benefits? Fun, maybe. And that's it. And if you put it that way, fun is always going to lose. But if you realize that on the positive side, there's actually all these functional benefits as well, then you may still end up going, yeah, but still, the costs are too high. And that's fine. That may be the decision you make, but you need to actually have both sides in your calculus. And we haven't had that until now. I think we've had a very myopic and uninformed view of the role of chemical intoxicants in our lives.
Great, thank you. Mimi just put something in the chat, and I think it's a great ending point and a jumping off point. She says, wondering about human beings' historic need or desire to alter their consciousness in general, not related to social interaction, not only by drugs, but even by spinning as little kids do, for example, but that's a topic for another time. And I love that as a thing to end on and for us all to think about after this fascinating conversation. We do have the books. They are for sale. We ship domestically if anybody still doesn't have their copy, or purchase them like Ryan did from your local bookstore. Thank you so much, Edward, for joining us this evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you have a lovely evening as well.
You too. Bye.
Cheers.